Good afternoon. The first item of business is consideration of Business Motion 18135 in the name of Jamie Hepburn on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau on changes to business. Any member who wishes to speak to the motion should press the request to speak button now. And I call on Jamie Hepburn, Minister, to move the motion.
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr Hepburn. No member has asked to speak to the motion. Therefore, the question is that motion 18135 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. Are we all agreed? Yes. The Parliament is agreed, and the motion is therefore agreed. And I turn to the next item of business, which is consideration of Parliamentary Bureau Motion 18133 on suspension of standing orders. I ask Jamie Hepburn, Minister, on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau, to move the motion.
Move, Presiding Officer.
I would call other members who would wish to speak. I see Mr Carson has pressed his button.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I rise in opposition to the motion to suspend standing orders in relation to the legislation consent memorandum for the Animal Welfare Import of Cat, Dogs and Ferrets Bill. Let me begin by clearly stating I support the principles of improving animal welfare. On the surface, the proposals in this bill appear to support that aim. In a letter owner received a few hours ago, the Minister Jim Fairley states that the proposals included in this bill are strongly welcomed by animal welfare organisations as well as being supported by all political parties. And I agree with the Minister. But right now, we are not here to vote on principles. I am here to raise objections on how this place has the opportunity to scrutinise legislation. The Rural Affairs Committee, in its letter to the Minister for Agriculture and Connectivity, has made it clear that it has not had the time or capacity to consider this LCM before the motion is due to be debated this afternoon. This is not a procedural inconvenience, it is a fundamental failure of parliamentary scrutiny. The Scottish Parliament has been asked to delegate powers in devolved areas to the UK ministers without sufficient time to consider the implications. The Minister himself agrees that there has not been sufficient time and information for the committee to review this. I do, however, question his view that the Scottish Government has brought this to its attention at the earliest opportunity, given the Senate in Wales was given twice as long to consider the same LCM. The Minister's response to the committee, while appreciated, does not address the core issue of the limitation of this Parliament to scrutinise this properly. The bill proposes to give regulation-making powers not only to Scottish ministers but also to UK ministers in areas of devolved competence, raising serious constitutional concerns. Questions have not been answered. So why is it necessary for UK ministers to have these powers at all? The bill would give powers to the Scottish ministers, and it's not clear why UK ministers would need these powers too. What criteria should be used by the Scottish Government to determine whether regulations are laid by Scottish ministers scrutinised here or by UK ministers scrutinised at Westminster? In his latest letter received this morning, the Minister told us that there would be no set criteria, that decisions are made on an individual set of circumstances, but spells out the guiding factors which would influence these decisions. The Minister has said that there may be circumstances where ministers will wish to give consent to instruments where UK instruments where policy objectives are aligned, but that is not a sufficient explanation. We need to know what those circumstances are. We need to know what specific criteria will be used to decide when it is appropriate for UK ministers to act in devolved areas. And we need to ensure that the Scottish Parliament is notified and given sufficient time to consider those when these decisions are made. The committee has asked for that information. Presiding Officer, we have been told that any UK SIs would be notified to us, but this is a political commitment. And we know that with UK SIs notifications, we don't always have sufficient time to consider them. We also asked for a breakdown of whether powers in this policy area have been delegated to UK ministers or to Scottish ministers under their competence. These are not unreasonable questions. They are the basic requirements of democratic oversight. Presiding Officer, this is not about opposing the policy aims of the bill or LCM. It is about defending the role of this Parliament. It is about ensuring that we do not set a precedent where important decisions are rushed through without due process. It is about ensuring that the Scottish Parliament retains its rightful role in scrutinising legislation that affects the people of Scotland. Yes, Scottish legislation takes up parliamentary time, but that is the price of proper scrutiny. That is the price of protecting devolution, and that is the price of ensuring that this Parliament, not Westminster, decides how devolved powers are exercised. For those reasons, I cannot support this motion to suspend standing orders, and I urge colleagues to do the same.
Thank you, Mr Carson. I call on the Minister, should he wish to respond.
Thank you very much, President Officer. Let me first of all say I recognise any member's right to speak against any motion that's presented before it. I recognise any member's right to vote against any legislative consent motion. Indeed, I suppose I recognise any member's right to vote against the varying or the suspension of standing orders. I recognise the right of any committee to determine not to report on a legislative consent motion. But what I would say, and I think this speaks to the point that has just been made by the convener, it's about the role of this Parliament. I would be concerned that if we do not agree this motion today, then we would be denying this Parliament the collective opportunity to consider the question of whether or not to grant legislative consent to the UK Parliament. I do not think we should be denying that opportunity. And let me be clear, the effect of not suspending standing orders in this instance would deny Parliament that opportunity, with no guarantee. In fact, I think it's almost inevitable that the UK Parliament would continue to press ahead with this legislation without us even having had the opportunity whether or not to say we grant consent or do not grant consent. Of course, I'll give way to the convener.
I appreciate the Minister giving way. I don't know whether the Minister actually listened to the content of my contribution. This was not about this particular LCM. It's the principle of the Government bringing forward LCMs for consideration of this Parliament and not giving sufficient time for the Parliament to undertake its duty to scrutinise those LCMs adequately.
Minister.
Well, I've heard the convener very clearly. I don't know if he was listening to me. The fundamental point is what he is seeking to do right now in opposing this motion is denying this Parliament collectively the opportunity to even consider the question of whether or not we grant legislative consent. I'm not clear if the convener realises that's what he's doing, but that is what he is seeking to do. And I understand and I recognise that it is regrettable that the committee feels it's not had the time to fully consider this issue. But what I would respectfully say, of course, is that this matter is not entirely in the gift of the Scottish Government. This is a matter that's been considered by the UK Parliament. The UK Parliament determines its own timescale. It is not determined by the Scottish Government. Of course, I'll give way.
Rhoda Grant.
I think we're somewhat puzzled in the committee that the Welsh Parliament considered LCMs on considered this LCM some time ago, and we weren't given the same notice in this Parliament. This is not about the content of the LCM. This is very much about the process and giving committees of this Parliament time to consider legislation properly.
Minister.
Well, and I recognise the importance of doing that, and insofar as we can, we will always do that. In respect of the point that the Senate may have granted its consent, what I would respectfully say is that's because they're considering the legislation in the Welsh context. We have to consider it in terms of its practical application in the Scottish context. Now, I hear members laughing, but that is the fundamental responsibility of this Government in the first instance, to then give this Parliament the opportunity to consider it in the Scottish context. And I see Mr Kerr thinks that's embarrassing. He's the great proponent. He's the great proponent of this Parliament having the responsibility to consider these matters. He wants to deny Parliament the opportunity to consider this matter today. Let me speak to the timescale that we have had to operate to. This is a private member's bill at Westminster. As such, the Parliament standing orders make it clear that an LCM can only be lodged when the bill has completed the first amending stage, which was the committee stage in the House of Commons on the 14th of May. The Scottish Government sought to lodge the LCM as quickly as possible and did so on the 3rd of June. And the reason for that was precisely what I've just laid out. There had to be that process of engagement to clarify certain areas so that this Government was satisfied in coming forward to say to Parliament, we think legislative consent should be granted. Should we have not undertaken that responsibility? Should we have just breenged in and said we've not even looked at the matter and we bring it to Parliament without considering it? I don't think that's something opposition members would expect us to do. And in that sense, I urge Parliament to vote for this motion right now.
Thank you, Minister. The question is that motion 18133, in the name of Jamie Hepburn, on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau, on suspension of standing orders, be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. The Parliament is not agreed. There will therefore be a move to a vote, and there will be a short suspension to allow members to access the digital voting system.